Good afternoon and welcome to this lovely space here in our hometown of Milwaukee. So my name is Dan Renoir. I am the Managing Director of Strategic Initiatives at Baird. This is our headquarter city and this is our headquarter space. So welcome. What a great showcase for the city. I'm going to give you just a little bit on Baird. So Baird, I joined the firm 25 years ago. And 25 years ago, we were a tenth the size we are now. We were this regional boutique, mostly wealth advisory firm. And when I came here for what I thought was going to be a 2-year stop, I fell in love with the city and fell in love with this place. And on top of it, I was going to a firm that most of my friends from New York said, who the hell could have an investment bank in Milwaukee? That can't be. Well, I love competing with those folks. So 25 years later, we're 10 times larger. We're fully throughout the United States, very global, 3.5 billion-ish of revenue, 5,000 employees, and very proud to call Milwaukee our hometown. I'm going to give you just a little parallel. So I'm on the board of the MKE Tech Hub, in addition to my role at Baird, which you're going to hear a little bit more about. But MKE Tech Hub has obviously put this whole thing together. So we're really excited to have you all here with Steve Case, founder of AOL, who has written a book that hopefully you all have a copy of. And thanks for coming here to that. So my journey, I grew up in Seattle, Washington. So most of you maybe have been to Seattle. Some of you have been to Seattle. You've heard about Seattle. I grew up in Seattle before Seattle was cool. So Seattle, Washington, before Microsoft, before Amazon, before it was known for a lot of the things it's known for now. So I then moved away when I was 15 to Florida, Alabama, to Philadelphia, sometime in Indiana, Houston, Texas. And when I would travel around the country and meet people, they would say, oh, Seattle, it rains a lot. That was what I heard a lot early. And then later, now you mentioned Seattle, nobody says that. People talk about the tech ecosystem. They talk about the vibrancy of that city. They talk about music. Lately, they might talk about homelessness and crime there downtown, but that's a separate topic. But in Milwaukee, I think there's a bit of a parallel because I came here, as I said, in 1998, and I chose to stay. Fell in love with the city. It's just a phenomenal place, as you all know. You've got the lake, you've got the water, parks, rivers, amazing schools, great place to raise a family. So it's an awesome place. We had a great discussion at lunch a minute ago, and Steve Case talked about having a place people want to live as being just a really important component of building a successful tech ecosystem, and I think we have that here. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our host for the Ian, you want to come on up here? Our host for this reception is Expedient, who's been a great partner to the MKE Tech Hub and to the Wisconsin ecosystem. And from Expedient, we have Ian Christian, who's going to share a few words.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And thanks, everybody, for being here today. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be an exciting presentation. So I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of our Expedient family here in Milwaukee, and then our Expedient family across the U.S. as well. A lot of collaboration, great conversations this week. I looked down this morning. I thought, heck, it's Wednesday. A lot of stuff to come. So really excited to end the week strong here, too. So thanks to the MKE Tech Hub getting us together to be able to collaborate together and innovate together and ultimately grow together is really what we're looking for here. So having the chance to do that is great. I hope everyone enjoys.
And thank you to both Ian as well as Dan and Baird for hosting today. So I'm Molly Mulroy. I'm Chief Administrative Officer for WEC Energy Group, and I'm also the chair of MKE Tech Hub. So thrilled to have all of you here. We think about sort of, having Steve here today and how are we thinking about all of this? I think there's a few major components. Number one is we just think about our opportunities here to build Milwaukee as a tech community. We think about the opportunities to build talent inclusively with a goal of really doubling that and really creating that through economic prosperity and through life-changing jobs. It goes a long way. And so when we think about, what does something like that take? Well, it takes collaborators. And we look around this room, it's all of you. It's beyond these walls, right? It's our community. How do we work together? I mean, it's everything from, various sectors. When we think about, fintech or power or entrepreneurs and startups to leadership, right? We've got everything from government officials to leaders of companies, really across the landscape. So collectively, how do we all work together as we continue to build and grow this fantastic community that we have? And then, lastly, when we just think about overall opportunities and how do we just, during the course of our lunch, spurring really different ideas about how we might think about things differently and how we continue to grow working together. So we're super excited to have Steve and Gordon here today. They're going to do a fireside chat around the book, leave an opportunity for Q&As, and really looking forward to all of your engagement as part of that exploration. So thank you for being here today. And with that, I will turn it over.
Fireside chat with no fire.
We like to do things differently here in Milwaukee.
It's kind of warm in the sun, though.
It is. That's why I'm taking off this jacket here.
Trying to show a little respect.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to turn my microphone on, otherwise you won't hear me. I saw that. You're giving me the signal. I'm a stupid guy. I forgot. All right. Now you hear me?
We hear you fine, Steve. Well, thank you, Steve, for coming out to Milwaukee, our beautiful home here. I like to say that Milwaukee is the best kept secret in America, but we're tired of keeping it a secret, right? Okay, we're going to hopefully get Milwaukee out there. So, Steve, earlier in lunch today, as some of you might have known, we had a luncheon earlier. We got a chance to talk to Steve with some of the areas of the book. What I'd like to do is just start with your background and how you grew up. There are not many Fortune 500 leaders that came out of Hawaii, right? So many of you may not know this, but Steve was born in Hawaii. So can we just start before we dive into the book with you talking about how your background and how you were raised might have influenced how you planted yourself into AOL? Having the confidence, I think that, for me personally speaking, I've been in Milwaukee now for about 10 years or so. My challenges in growing up were a little different than most people. So there are some entrepreneurs sitting in the room that come from challenged backgrounds. And so I consider that Hawaii is probably not the mainstream of production base for people going into Fortune 500 companies. So can we start with that?
Sure.
And just give everyone a background on how that influenced how you've
Well, first of all,
gotten
it's
to where you
great
are.
to be here. Thank you, Baird, for hosting us. Great story on the 10x growth over the last couple of decades and kind of proving that Milwaukee can be a real powerhouse in terms of innovation and job creation and economic vitality and so forth. And actually the introductory remarks kind of summarize kind of why I'm focused on Rise the Rest and even why I wrote the book, which was the need for collaboration in communities to create that sense of momentum, possibility that leads to more entrepreneurial success. It doesn't happen by accident. It requires everybody working together. And also the story around Seattle is interesting. I'll answer your question about Hawaii,
Sure.
but on Seattle, which is the only, as you're saying, Seattle 40, 50 years ago was struggling. It was really struggling. The industries that it relied on were in decline, and there were a lot of people that were, I wouldn't call it despair, but there was quite significant anxiety. So what happened? Microsoft, which became sort of the iconic tech company in Seattle, was there for one reason. The two founders, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, wanted to go home. They were from there. They moved away. They actually founded Microsoft. Microsoft started in Albuquerque, New Mexico, not Seattle. But after a little while, they said, you know what? We want to move home. Amazon, the only reason Amazon moved to Seattle, and Jeff Bezos was in New York City and famously drove across the country to launch in Seattle, was because Microsoft was there. And he said, they have a bunch of engineers. I need somebody to write a bunch of code to create this e-commerce site. I'm going to go to Seattle and pick off some of their engineers. And then, a bunch of other things like that. And suddenly Seattle went from despair to, kind of tremendous momentum. And that's what we're trying to encourage in more cities. And that's why we on this mission to, help these cities rise and help level the playing field. In terms of my own background, it's kind of interesting. I was actually, dates me, but when I was born, Hawaii was not yet a state. My first birthday, it became a state. Big party on my first birthday. It's like, oh, hey, happy birthday. Well, it's actually not about you. And both my parents were born and raised in Hawaii. So my family going back over 100 years. It wasn't a military thing. It wasn't just a temporary thing. It was kind of, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. I lived there till I left to go to college. Interesting. It just shows you should always be nice to everybody because you never know what's going to happen. I went to high school with President Obama. Neither he nor I would ever have been on anybody's list of likely to succeed.
Wow. From Hawaii.
But yeah. you never know. We were in high school together. I was a little bit older. I was a senior. He was a freshman, so I didn't know him super well. I remember playing basketball with him. But it's an interesting kind of random story. So there are many positives about being in Hawaii. There were some negatives, though. And we've seen this traveling around the country. Hawaii, as a culture and as a community, is quite cautious, quite risk averse. More, let's keep things the way they are, kind of protect the status quo. Not super interested in doing new things. And as a result, it has struggled. Thankfully, it happens to be a nice place to visit, and thankfully, Boeing created the jumbo jet in I think it was in the 60s, 70s. So tourism has basically propped up the economy there. But otherwise, it would be really, really in trouble because it hasn't been able to. It's getting a little better now, but hasn't been able to create a strong startup community. So growing up there, I think that was a little bit instructive. Starting the company I founded, America Online, in 1985 in Northern Virginia, kind of outside of DC. When there's no venture capital there, none. All our venture capital came from other places. Nobody believed in startups back then. This is almost 40 years ago. Really hard to get people to leave big companies to join our little company. And we struggled for a decade, but finally it broke through. I think all of that helps give me a certain passion about backing the entrepreneurs in these places and trying to create more thriving startup communities in more places.
Fantastic. I'm so glad that you decided to capture that in the book, right? So jumping into the book, your fund has funded over 200 and made over 200 investments. Your tour has gone over 43 different cities. You've been to Pittsburgh, you've been to Chattanooga, you've been to Omaha. So can you talk about some of the lessons that you've seen in those communities and how they've been able to help their entrepreneurial ecosystem achieve success?
Well, first of all, a little backstory why I even got started in this, which is more of a random accident. I was asked a little over a decade ago to co-chair something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. I said, okay, yeah, I'm happy to help. And that opened my eyes to a couple of things that I guess I should have been aware of, but wasn't aware of. Number one was the role that new companies, startups play in job creation. If you look at the net job creation in this country, while small business accounts for a lot of jobs, and big business, like Fortune 500, accounts for a lot of jobs, new businesses under 5 years account for most of the new job creation. Interesting. Well, so startups are important, not just tech startups, any kind of startup. Did not know that. Second thing I did not know and was shocked by is that 75% of venture capital goes to 3 states. Wow. California, New York, Massachusetts, 75%. And while not every new company wants or needs venture capital, the correlation between the most successful companies that create the most jobs and create the most economic vitality overwhelmingly do raise venture capital. So it disadvantages the entrepreneurs in Wisconsin and advantages the entrepreneurs in California. So what happens? A lot of people growing up in Milwaukee, perhaps some of your friends, maybe even some of your family members say, I've got to leave here. There's not much opportunity here if I want to be part of that world. So there's been a big brain drain in these different places. So slowing the brain drain of people leaving and creating a boomerang of people returning is what this is all about. That then led to that advisory council to start launching these bus tours about 8 years ago. That then led about 5 years ago saying, well, let's prove that investing in entrepreneurs in these places makes good business sense. Let's launch a fund that can generate top tier returns that will surprise people on the coast and result in more capital flowing to more of these cities. So that's sort of the backstory. And the reason I wrote the book is having spent most of the decade doing this and traveling a lot of places, I was always blown away by what I was seeing in these cities, the entrepreneurs I met, what's happening in these cities, and most people, when I tell them about this city or that city,
You're right.
completely unaware.
Right.
And so, there's a lot of examples. In the interest of time, I'll just give you a few. There's not too far from here in Indianapolis, this company got acquired by Salesforce 5-6 years ago. Salesforce now has 2,000 employees in Indianapolis, second largest office outside of San Francisco, and it's gone on to create dozens of startups that in that ecosystem in the Indianapolis, which most people don't know is a strong startup city, is really showing momentum. A lot of things happening around Salt Lake City, enterprise software. A lot of things happening around Atlanta because Georgia Tech is in the engineering talent. I was just in Detroit on Monday, and in some ways Detroit is the most interesting story if I had to pick one, because I was there when we launched the first Rise of Us tour 8 years ago, and the downtown Detroit area was mostly vacant.
Okay.
Most of the buildings were largely empty, and it was some scary place to be. I remember going out of a Westin hotel that morning, and I was going to go for a jog, and the guy in front said, "Don't go that way. That's unsafe. Go that way." I go, "Oh, okay." I was back there on Monday. You can go anywhere. The buildings are now full. The city, the downtown area at least, is vibrant. Dozens of startups. We back Shinola, we back StockX. A bunch of these companies are showing tremendous momentum. And so a city that was hugely important to innovation 100 years ago with a car, then lost its way, lost 60% of its population in 50 years, 60%. And then the year before we came with our bus, went bankrupt. City of Detroit went bankrupt.
That's right.
And now is rising again because of a focus on startups, a focus on entrepreneurs. So the message I would encourage all of you to think about is, presumably you're here because you care about Milwaukee.
Yeah.
If you care about Milwaukee, investing in some of these new companies, some of which will fail, because that's the nature of startups, but some of which will succeed and be the big companies of tomorrow, is the best way to maximize the likelihood you have a vital, thriving community 25 years from now. The data on this point is really interesting. Half of the Fortune 500 turns over every 25 years. Half. So as a city, you're resting on your old, we got these 500, some of them are going to go away. I had dinner with Warren Buffett the night before we did our Omaha tour. And Warren's wonderful and Omaha's wonderful. They have not launched a new Fortune 500 company in a century. A century. There's 2 or 3 Mutual of Omaha in a century. That's not good. So you have to renew the community. You have to reinvest. You have to invest in the future, and that means backing these entrepreneurs and creating a startup ecosystem that makes it easier for people to start and scale. It makes it easier for people to stay versus leave. Makes it easier for people who left to return. Suddenly, you see momentum.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I liked about the book. You talked about the underlying aspects of what led to that, right? So based on what you shared in the book, you've made over 1,400 regional new venture funds have started ever since you guys started your tour, the Rise of the Rest Fund in 2014. From there, you've been able to show over the last 10 years that there's been a 600% growth in the venture dollars into these different communities. And so I think about that, and I think about where we are in Milwaukee, and I think about the fact that the ecosystem in these certain areas, there was this larger group. I can't imagine that these venture capital funds just started forming just because you came around.
Not at all.
So there was sort of a bigger picture legislative governmental support in some of these communities. Perhaps you can talk about that. And I'll give you an example. In our region here, in the state of Indiana, there's a $250 million fund of funds that supports VCs and supports entrepreneurial ecosystems in their cities. I'm sure that Indianapolis has been a benefactor of that. In Illinois, there's a $1 billion fund of funds. In Wisconsin, we've talked about various ways that government can support the development of the ecosystem. Perhaps you can share with us maybe some of the lessons that you've seen and spurring the development of the ecosystems in some of the areas that you've been
Yeah,
in?
first of all, as you said, the 1,400 new venture firms in what we call Rise of the Rest cities, which we define as outside of San Francisco, New York, and
That's
Boston,
right.
so the rest of the country, is virtually nothing to do with us. It was a natural development when investors saw opportunities in cities, and often they were former entrepreneurs who had success and said, I'm going to start a firm to back the next generation of entrepreneurs in that city, not in some kind of philanthropic way, because they knew some of these people had the opportunity to create some really gigantic companies that would generate great returns. And I was with the other day, the founder of a firm called Drive Capital in Columbus. Two people that worked for Sequoia in Silicon Valley ended up moving to Ohio. And most people were, it's about 10 years ago, most people were skeptical, like, what are you doing? You're like at Sequoia, you know, certainly one of the top 5, some would say the best venture firm in the world in Silicon Valley, like, you're like at the top of the top of the top.
Yeah.
Why would you move to Ohio and start a firm from scratch? He said, because we actually believe the next generation of companies are going to be here, and there's no venture capital, or very little venture capital there. They now have $2 billion under management,
Wow.
and they've become a very significant force in the region. There's a lot of those stories. In terms of the government question, I think government can be helpful, and some of these states that are doing fund-to-funds, I think are helpful. The U.S. government just passed legislation 2 months ago as part of the CHIPS and Science Act that is authorized $10 billion of funding to support more regional hubs. And it's worth noting, like Silicon Valley, Austin, didn't happen by accident. A lot of it was anchored around initial funding, around semiconductor research, things like that. So I think that can be helpful as well. But ultimately, it comes down to the people in the communities to rally together, including some of the big companies that exist, saying we're going to support this next generation of companies, for people to be willing to start companies. I have an idea, I'm going to take the risk of starting that company, and people initially locally and over time from other places being willing to back those companies. That's really what moves this, not as opposed to government or something else.
That's great. That's great to know. And I think that in the Milwaukee area, there's good synergies within our local ecosystem. We have Green Bay in the north, we have Madison here. And in the book, you talked about the connection between Lincoln and Omaha and how your bus tour kind of spurred that on. If we think about regional growth, can you share with us some of the lessons that kind of came out of that? Can you talk about the Omaha Lincoln situation and how they were able to benefit from a closer connectivity?
Yeah, I think there's definitely value to clustering, and so creating a little bit of a critical mass. And Lincoln and Omaha about an hour away from each other, but they had some industries like ag tech that they're particularly focused on. University there had real strength there, but they were kind of doing their own thing, kind of in their own silos. And what we see in most cities is cities are doing their own thing, and then within the cities, different groups are doing their own thing. It's super disconnected, super fragmented, which is crazy. And more collaboration has to be, more connectivity has to be part of it. And so what we're seeing now around the country is more of this regional clustering, and a lot of people thinking about Milwaukee may be thinking more broadly about Wisconsin, and so you're kind of, in order for Milwaukee to rise, maybe Wisconsin has to rise. So therefore, looking for ways to cooperate, and with cities like Madison and Green Bay makes sense. And we were in Madison a number of years ago with our bus tour, and a lot of things happening because of the university there, and the success of Epic and the health tech sector has been interesting. When we were in Green Bay, they were talking about launching what's now Titletown Tech in partnership with the Packers and Microsoft, and this real estate across the street from Lambeau Field. I went back to it last fall, and it's open, and it's actually quite exciting. Create a gathering place, sort of anchor kind of place within the the city. So things are happening, and I want to be respectful to the audience here. I'm grateful you came out to see me, but Milwaukee needs to step up its game. There's a lot of Milwaukee, as you know. I just found this out. You know it. It's bigger than Madison and Green Bay combined. But if you look at the startup momentum, it doesn't have the momentum it should have, and I think that's because of some of the risk aversion in cities like, as I mentioned, like in Hawaii. I think that's because of the fragmentation, siloed nature of it. So I would just encourage people to kind of seize the moment, particularly right now, because this pandemic, we haven't quite gotten out of it, but hopefully we're kind of towards the end of it. something fundamental has happened. It's almost like a shake the snow globe moment for society. And nobody, I certainly don't know exactly how it's going to settle out, but a lot of people have taken a step back, decided, how do I want to live? Where do I want to live? Where do I want to work? Remote work, hybrid work, a bunch of different things. And that's going to result in the next decade a reset, a dispersion of talent that I think will surprise people. And cities like Milwaukee can really benefit if you say, this is the moment, how do we attract people who have never been here, but also get people to boomerang back who left thinking there were greener pastures, and now's the time to be back. So I really think this is a moment, and the cities that really decide to capitalize on the moment, I think are going to be benefit more than they think over the next decade.
Oh, absolutely. And in the book you talk about the great unbundling of communities that were not central to attracting talent. All of a sudden, they have their Zoom town, and they're talking about their affordable and dynamic nature of their communities, that people can go and actually vacation and work. And so I think Milwaukee is in that category. But I'm really kind of curious, in your next tour, right? So with the tours that you guys go through, you visit 5 cities in 5 days and you spend $500,000, right? And in this next 9.0, I don't think it's been quite settled. Can you talk about when the next bus tour is going to happen and some of the cities that you're planning on visiting on that tour?
Haven't decided. We had a tour plan, I think it was 2.5 years ago, and had to obviously cancel it because of the pandemic, and that was going to be Wichita, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, Tulsa, a bunch of cities in that area, but we have not rescheduled it. But the bus tours initially were a way for us to see firsthand what's happening, and their team spent like 6 months in advance, talking to people, understanding what's happening, and then when we're there, actually trying to figure out ways. It's part of the reason we even have a bus, to use the bus as sort of this rolling convening platform to get people connected, and we invite people to join us from different, Silicon Valley, other places, so they see what's happening in those. And at the end of it, we do a pitch competition, and we do invest in the winner of each company. But the pitch competition has nothing to do with why we're there. It's almost like a nice little media event, something gives somebody to talk about. It's much more about trying to drive that collaboration, and we've ended up making, in the last decade, 40 investments in companies that won pitch competitions, and 160 other investments that had nothing to do with the pitch competitions, but had to do with the relationships we built in those communities, particularly with regional venture capitalists. So we'll continue to do those, but they're not as central to what we're doing. It's really much more about trying to, at this point, mobilize more of these startup communities to take the next step to be more successful in this next decade.
And that's important for us. We don't know if Milwaukee will be included in one of those bus tours. Obviously, we would like that. But for some of the entrepreneurs, that's right. And this is a very important point, because for the entrepreneurs in the room, you don't necessarily need to wait for a bus tour to be able to reach out to your fund. Is that correct, or do you only do investments?
No. Most of our investments are in cities that we haven't visited.
Fantastic. And Steve, I know we're running out of time. I just want to pan it back to where we are in this current political climate. We have a new mayor. Cavalier Johnson is now our new mayor in Milwaukee, and we're really working hard to formulate that vision, like the Fresh Coast City, right? Things that'll attract new talent into our city and attract and coalesce around technology and growth, and that's what we're really trying to do and accomplish in the MKE Tech Hub Coalition. And so given that, right, can you talk about maybe the role of policies in encouraging the entrepreneurial ecosystem development in some of the communities that you've gotten a chance to visit?
One thing that's encouraging, I sense is happening in Milwaukee too, is over the last decade I've met with a lot of mayors, a lot of governors, spoken at a lot of their conferences, met them when we've traveled around. And I would say overwhelmingly a decade ago, when they thought of economic development, it was about getting big companies to move, shift headquarters, or to open a factory or something, but it was almost exclusively focused on big companies. In the last few years, there's still some of that obviously, but it's shifted to more, how do you create a fertile environment to launch new companies, which is really important, because a lot of those deals that get cut end up not being all that smart. it's also, frankly, zero sum for the country. You know,
Right.
It gets us to leave here to go there because you paid them a bunch of money. Doesn't really help, help the country overall. And creating an environment that allows new companies to flourish and more people to move there and more people to invest there is really the only sustainable way to kind of drive economic development. So that's the first step is just recognizing that it's the new companies that likely will play a pretty significant role in your community's future, and figuring out ways to do that, which is sometimes using the bully pulpit, sometimes using the ability to convene people, sometimes using there could be angel tax incentives, things like that that different places have done. So there are different plays you can run, but it starts with saying we need to focus more on these entrepreneurs and less on the big company CEOs. But we also need to figure out ways to engage the larger companies in supporting the smaller companies, which is why that's been a key discussion throughout the day.
That's right, and I appreciate you saying that. In Milwaukee, you could say that in some of the cities that you visited, right, there's a focused theme of technology. In Pittsburgh, you have robotics. In Chattanooga, you have logistics. In Omaha, insurance tech. Nashville, healthcare tech. When you think about Milwaukee and what you've seen so far, right, we are trying to get the best kept secret in America out. We, in our ecosystem here, there's a lot of work in fintech, there's water tech. You could say that we're probably the advanced manufacturing capital. And we also are very good in power controls and energy sector. With some of those areas that Milwaukee has shown some good nucleus and depth, have any of those companies are you seeing any trends in your investments among those areas in your portfolio, like advanced manufacturing, water tech, and so forth? Because I know in your book you talked about one company that got started in Indianapolis. There was a water tech that seemed to kind of break through the boundaries. And I think you could say that in Milwaukee we're so well diverse in our technology that coalescing hasn't really kind of come to the fore.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I've heard throughout the day, some of the same themes around manufacturing, water, and so forth, beer. Hear beer a lot in Milwaukee.
That's right.
That are areas to build on and figuring out ways to leverage those in terms of some new companies being partners with those companies to help those existing companies be more successful and also help launch the new companies is certainly important. And we have seen as we've traveled around, there tends to be some industry clusters, some expertise that's been built up over decades that can be leveraged in terms of some of these new companies in a potentially pretty transformative kind of way. But I think it's also important to keep your mind open that even though there's particular sectors that you might naturally focus on, a lot of the entrepreneurial ideas really could start and scale anywhere. And so we see a mix where there's some there's an expectation in some cities based on some of their sectors, whether it be logistics or health tech or manufacturing, have you, that not surprisingly there are a lot of companies that are coming out of it. But there are also things that just that pop up that just surprise me. It's sort of like, well, that company kind of could have been anywhere. And there's one in Detroit we backed called StockX, which now is 1,500 people. Just started about 5 years ago. Be multi-billion-dollar IPO probably the next year or so. It depends on the IPO window. And started 5 years ago, a few people, a little idea, and it's been they've been able to create a lot of really interesting jobs, not just coding jobs, a lot of other jobs in Detroit. But most people would think that company would be in Silicon Valley. It was like why that's in. And most people would think a company like Epic, which is the leader in electronic medical records, would be in Boston, not in Madison. So there is a dynamic here where you have to build on your strengths so you can differentiate, but also keep your mind open to the idea of could start anywhere. One of the great stories, I'll be there in a couple weeks in Northwest Arkansas. Bentonville, Sam Walton has this little idea. I want to create a store to give people in rural areas, better product selection at lower prices. All right, seemed like a good idea. Well, now, like Walmart has the largest company in the world, like 2 million employees or something, and still based in Bentonville. Nobody would think, well, why would Bentonville? It wouldn't strike, startup hub, Bentonville. So these things sometimes can surprise you.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the focus of the Rise of the Rest is really industry agnostic. It's almost technology agnostic. You're looking for the next opportunity, be it the metaverse or anything else that can really break through the growth threshold, right? I think that's encouraging to most entrepreneurs in the room. And, you know, we talk about the fact that when you're out there, you're going into these areas of America that are not frequently traveled. Have you had any experience outside of the cities in terms of your growth focus and your investment focus, right?
Yeah, no.
USDA, rural areas, I think you could say that in Wisconsin, 60% of our economy is driven by non-city areas. And so it's a pretty significant
I'd say
part of our
two
community.
things. Yes, I'll give you an example, but we do believe that even though remote work is more possible, there is value in clustering people together. And we do believe even in cities, there's value in clustering people together, which is why things like what I mentioned in Green Bay, the Titletown Tech is super helpful, or what the OTR neighborhood in Cincinnati, which is where the entrepreneurs hang out, is pretty helpful, and or the area in Chattanooga, there tends to be these innovation districts that develop in cities. So there is value to being in cities. It just doesn't mean you have to be in San Francisco, New York, and Boston. It doesn't mean you have to be in a city, a mega city with millions of people. It could be 100,000, 200,000, but you still have to figure out ways to cluster people together, and ideas bounce off each other and so forth. But there are a lot of great examples of things that, to your question, that are more in rural areas. There's an entrepreneur came to see us, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, kept pretty persistent. Finally, we took a meeting and kept pitching and kept pitching and kept pitching. He said, I have this idea of opening a greenhouse, indoor greenhouse in coal country in Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, Appalachia. And I think the reason this is going to make sense is because the way I've designed it, based on some technology we're getting from some folks in Europe, it uses 90% less water, so it's more sustainable, and its location is 70% of the U.S. population is within 24-hour drive, so it's convenient to get like fruits and vegetables, so it's healthier product, more sustainable. And I also believe I can create hundreds of jobs in coal country, in an area that for decades has been in decline and most people have given up on. Actually has a huge opioid problem, because there's a lack of hope and so forth. And we said, well, this is kind of crazy. It's like, this one's okay. We'll see. So but we decided let's give it a shot. So we wrote an initial check, like $100,000 check to allow them to get this thing going. And he got it going. Now raised several $100 million, and they have created over 500 jobs in eastern Kentucky. A company called App Harvest, and so that's an example of somebody with this idea that was going to do, and it's now I think the largest indoor greenhouse in the country.
Wow! And
it's in an area that, and the wonderful story there. I remember visiting when they were building it a couple of years ago, and there's still a construction site, and there was a woman in like a lawn chair, kind of outside the construction camp, but kind of watching it.
Yeah.
And it turned out she was going there every day
to watch the build.
and so finally it's just watching this, like watching this, and of course somebody's like, why are you here every day?
Right.
And she said, for I think 30 years I've been praying that something would happen that would create a spark of hope in this community.
Wow.
And this is it. So this is what entrepreneurs can do. When you're investors, you're investing in their ideas. You're saying, I'm going to invest this at this valuation. I want it to be worth that. I want to make money on my investments. So I get returns from all our investors. That's a key part of it. If you're building a company, you say, I want to create a better product service. I have this better idea, some better angle. I want to improve people's lives in some kind of way. And I also want to create something that is kind of valuable and durable. That's obviously important. But there's a broader issue here, which is how do you create jobs, hope, and opportunity for people in places that are left behind. And right now in this country, 70%, Pew Research, 70% of people in this country wake up anxious and worried about the future. They're scared about the future.
Yeah.
Not working for them. How do you give them more of a sense of opportunity? And jobs is not the only answer, but it's a key part of it.
Yes.
And entrepreneurs launching new companies are critical to do that, and my hope is Milwaukee will continue to build on its momentum and launch some of those companies that really can build the future, shape the future, and create more of that opportunity.
Well, I know that there are people in this room and companies in our region that are going to do that exact same thing. The book is called The Rise of the Rest, How Entrepreneurs in Surprising Places Are Building the New American Dream. If you haven't read it yet, I recommend it. It's a great book. And I want to, on behalf of the MKE Tech Hub Coalition, I want to thank you, Steve, for visiting us. Thank you for giving us your time. And I want to just also close up by, I'm sorry?
Taking some questions.
And close up by taking some questions.
So I was a business reporter here for a long time.
Sorry?
I'm the person you named in your book, but you didn't put my name, the Journal Sentinel reporter. I know the business community.
That way, uh-oh.
No, I think it's great that you gave the credit to the Journal Sentinel. That's who should get the
And
credit.
I also got credit today for mentioning Milwaukee. I talked about Green Bay, but the only mention of Milwaukee was Milwaukee. You know, okay, keep
I
going.
think
I'm
it's
sorry.
great. So my question is, and I hope there will be others, but my question is, I covered the business community here for a long time, and there is a big chunk of the business community here working very hard to get complete control for the Republicans of the state politics. And the reason is that they believe they want to implement their tax policy. They want to implement a tax policy that they think will lure bigger companies to the state. And you kind of touched on this a little, but what would you say to them about this idea of using lower taxes to lure big companies to Wisconsin?
Well, I don't know the details, and I'm pretty good at ducking any question about politics. I do it deliberately because I spend a lot of time on policy around innovation entrepreneurship. I think the only reason I've been effective is because I'm, kind of viewed as not taking sides and stay out of, kind of political debate. So I don't know the specifics of it. I would say the way you've framed it, tax policy that could drive economic growth and job creation probably makes sense, but it might make more sense if it's skewed towards helping the new companies scale. And so I don't know exactly what that means. Again, I don't know exactly what's being considered here. I do not believe efforts around, as I said before, economic growth that are exclusively focused on big companies are sustainable.
We do have the Foxconn example.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I walked downtown and saw a Foxconn sign and said, "Hi, wonder what people are thinking about Foxconn right now." It seemed like it was going to be a big thing, didn't work out. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And again, each of these things have to be analyzed separately. I'm sure there are logical reasons with some of the deals that are cut for big companies to move headquarters or open second headquarters or what have you that do make economic sense, and that should of course be part of the equation. But I think the best bet and the most sustainable bet and the most cost-effective payback on investment bet is to have more of a bias towards launching new companies as opposed to luring existing companies. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hi. Quick question. You mentioned. Oh, thank you so much. You mentioned that Milwaukee needs to step up, right? And I think as residents and leaders of the city, we're all swimming in the same ecosystem and have a very specific perspective, right? And I think you, as a cosmopolitan, have an external perspective. So my question revolves around: what do you think are the next 3 steps, 3 to 5, maybe just 3 steps that Milwaukee needs to take to move in the right direction to where continue to build this ecosystem and continue to grow our city, which is an overall goal for the community, and to create wealth for communities of color also.
Well, first of all, it's fair to say that I sometimes in these things deliberately provoke people who to suggest that whatever you're doing, you could do more and you should do it with urgency. And I actually think it's better, we talked about this earlier, to think about Milwaukee and Madison and Green Bay and more of a regional cluster, but sometimes people are motivated by a little competition, and sometimes a little nudge seems to be helpful. And so part of that is saying that I think the data I saw is in the United States, in terms of the startup cities, Milwaukee number 51.
Wow.
Is that good? Maybe that's good. It seems like you could do better. And so how do you do better? And your question, I think there's two parts of it. What can you do to just be supportive generally around a stronger startup community? I think that requires some of the things we talked about. More focus on collaboration. You know, this African proverb, I think, inspires me. Hopefully it would inspire you. If you want to go quickly, you can go alone. If you want to go far, you must go together. A lot of people here, and a lot of people we've talked to earlier, are doing interesting things. Most people are not doing it with each other. Most people don't even know what each other's doing. And so, and that's the whole point of this week. And how do you create more of that, you know, collaboration? How do you win the battle for talent in terms of getting more people to move here, getting fewer people to leave here? And just show of hands, how many people have a member of their family who grew up here that's left and gone to some other city? Show of hands. Actually, not. I thought it'd be even more. You know, it's a majority, but not a super majority. Just ask yourself why, and is there anything that could change that might lead them to decide to be here? Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe they don't like you, but they probably did like it. They probably did like you. They probably decided there was better opportunity elsewhere. So how do you create the opportunity here that would lead them to say, you know, now's the time to come back? And the third piece is on the capital side. How do you unlock some capital? A lot of money in the city that's maybe investing in real estate or something, but not necessarily investing in startups. And it's risky, and investing in funds that are diversified might be the way to do it, but generate or other things. But you know, getting more of that capital. And then to add to the last part of your question, deliberately and intentionally figure out ways to do it in a more inclusive way. There's no question, the other data, for those who don't know it, I mentioned the 75% of venture capital going to 3 states. Get this, women are 50% of the population, but female founders get less than 10% of venture capital. Black Americans are 13% of the population, but get less than 1% of venture capital. Latinos get 2% of venture capital. Is that okay? Is that you know, why aren't we figuring out a way to be more inclusive? And some of that is around place, but some of that's also around people. That requires an intentionality. It requires kind of, you know, figuring out ways to connect people who are not presently, you know, connected. People have on-ramps. Ultimately, it should be the power of the idea, but at least give everybody a shot at making their pitch.
Can we get the microphone over here? Oh, there you go.
Two quick questions. Other than your book, what book should we add to our must-read list? And then second, define success.
First one's a good. First question was, what books, other books other than my book, should you add to your reading list? Let me think about that one. That's a good question. And the second, how do we define success? I'm not going to tell you how your community should define success, but I would say, here's how I would think about it. 25 years from now, is it a community on the rise where the economic growth is strong, people are moving there as opposed to, you know, leaving there, and you are, and have launched and continue to launch some of the Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow, and you've done that in a more inclusive way? And, you know, just to build on the Detroit story, to finish it, you know, I talked about the good part. Here's the backstory. 100 years ago, Detroit was Silicon Valley, the most innovative city in the country. 100 years ago, Silicon Valley was fruit orchards. They weren't growing startups, they were growing fruit. So now Silicon Valley is this powerhouse, and Detroit, you know, really has had a bad, you know, half century and kind of lost its way. And there was no amount of philanthropic support, no amount of government support that could catch that falling knife. The only thing was when the focus became on new companies and kind of creating a more vibrant, you know, startup community kind of centered around the downtown area. So I would, is your community something that the kids, grandkids, you know, want to live here, and it makes sense for them to live here because the best opportunity is here, and it is a, you know, city that has momentum and you know, and hope and possibility and so forth. And I would, you know, tracking, you know, some of the things around job creation, new company creation, you know, venture capital investing, people moving here. There's a bunch of ways you could track it, but that would be, you know, a key part of it. And I'll keep thinking about the book question.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for one last question, and then after that, we're going to close it up. And of course, you know, Steve will be staying after, and he'll be signing books. And so, welcome you to join afterwards.
I will answer one of the book questions.
Okay.
A friend of mine wrote a book a number of years ago called his name is Brad Feld, called Startup Communities, that builds on some of these ideas. So specifically on this topic, I think that would be a good one.
Yeah. So one last question.
I actually have a theory that I would love your feedback on, and it builds on something that you said, Gordon, about Zoom towns.
Yeah.
So Zoom towns is being defined as vacation locations where you can work from.
Yeah.
I've been tracking worker migration patterns over the last year and a half. And a lot of working professionals have left Silicon Valley and moved to Bozeman, Montana, or left New York to go to Portland, Maine. I imagine that there are some Chicago folks moving to Milwaukee for both cost of living and quality of life. And I wonder whether cities like Milwaukee and the rest of the cities that are featured on the cover of your book could market themselves as great destinations for working professionals that can work remotely, that might actually work for companies that might be across the country, across the world even. And then after 5 or 10 years of getting that experience, they quit those jobs, they start their own companies, and everything snowballs from there.
You're 100% agree. This is starting to happen, and sort of exactly what you described, my theory of the case, that the pandemic, you know, kind of created this unlock in terms of, you know, maybe I don't have to be in Silicon Valley to be an entrepreneur, to be an investor and so forth, which has helped. I think we hit peak Silicon Valley like 3 or 4 years ago, and it will still be strong, but it's not going to be as dominant. And overwhelmingly, the people have left some of these big superstar cities do continue to work remotely for their existing company. But after a few years, a couple things will happen. We're starting to see some of this. Number one, some of them will feel left out. You know, remote work has benefits, but you kind of aren't in the room where it happens, and that has an interesting impacts on culture and dynamics for some people, which might lead them to leave. Others, dynamics are, particularly as the market, you know, the economy tightens and inflation, and people look for trimming cost and, you know, for profitability, you know, some jobs are going to get cut, and a lot of companies, including a bunch in New York now, are saying, get back in the office. And people are saying, I better get back in the office because, you know, I don't want to be on that list. So there's some dynamics there that are also driving some of this in terms of what we're thinking. But the bigger dynamic is exactly what you said. Once you're in that city, most people, my theory is, you probably know better, but most, at least true with other cities, most people who are from Milwaukee have no idea what's happening in the startup community here. And for sure, most people have no connection with Milwaukee, have no clue. But once they're here and they're in the community and they start bumping into people and ideas and they see things, well, that's kind of interesting. And they might want to leave that company they're working for remotely to join a company. Or they might say, I actually have an idea. I want to start a company. So I think this is going to unleash a real acceleration in this dispersion of talent, this almost this great reset. People talk about the great resignation. I think this great reset in terms of what happens with people, and it's going to end up fueling, I believe, more startups being created, more investors, you know, backing companies, and more of these rising cities. What I do not know is, you know, when you fast forward, call it 10 years, what the list is going to look like, what the winner's circle is going to look like in terms of these rising cities. I have a theory based on, you know, some dynamics. But it's going to happen. It's going to be more what happens in the next few years. Like in Milwaukee, if people say this is a moment, let's really grab it, let's figure out ways to do with all the things we're talking about, then it has the opportunity to rise up. If not, others will rise up. So it's going to resort in a pretty interesting way. But there'll be far more of those people that, you know, as you said, go from, you know, remote working for someplace else to start thinking about doing something, you know, locally, which is why it's sort of a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reset the momentum around the startup community in these different Rise of the Rest cities. So
Yeah.
I would just urge you to seize the moment.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I can't can't thank you enough for coming and joining us. It's kind of a sneaky way of having us invite you to our 3rd-year anniversary party, is to bring somebody of such great knowledge.
I'm just
to our
bait.
city.
That's what you just said. I get it.
And I'm just going to do a couple of comments and maybe reinforce a couple of things in celebration of our 3-year anniversary. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting is everything you said about, you know, why we're here is our why, right? This innovation economy is what's going to drive the economy of the future. And GDP has historically been driven, 50% of it or more has been driven by innovation, and that will continue. And these are great jobs, and they are ones that are growing fast. They'll double again in the next 10 years. So the mission of the coalition, you heard it earlier from Molly, to inclusively double tech talent here in the region, both to drive economic prosperity, but also create life-changing opportunities. And we're so excited that, you know, we have over 125 organizations that have kind of joined us in that mission to do, you know, a couple of key things. And I'm going to go really quick because we're here for a different reason. But over the first 3 years, we've learned a ton. And we are a startup ourselves, right, in our first 3 years. So while we proved results and you could count noses on programs, we were building systems and partnerships and connections across the community, while also doing that in a way that drove the innovation ecosystem. And you can look at the stats. We're proud of the stats, but we have so much more to do. And we know that we're only at the starting line. And so with that said, I think you said it perfectly, which is we are at a pivotal moment. We are at a generational opportunity. The combination of what we have here in the region is our knowledge of physical spaces and products, et cetera, with digital on top, leads to an opportunity to create new partnerships and really get excited. But also this great unbundling that you talked about in your book. It creates new opportunities for us here. And then infuse that with the government investment that's going on right now. The time is now. And it takes all of us, and all of us in this room. And I thought it'd be fun to do just a little bit of something, which is, how many, if you work for the coalition, will you raise your hands? If you, now the board, if you're on the board, if you've been on a committee, keep them up. If you've been on a committee, have volunteered, are a member, if you have helped us in some other way, which there are about 1,000 partners in crime in this room.
Carl.
You raise your hands, and I think all of you, I mean, this is about all of us coming together, and we have such power to do that in the room, and that's, I think, what this is all about. So with that, we are only at the middle of Tech Week, although I feel like
Feels like the end.
we just got through this. I do feel a big sense of relief. There is a session right afterwards on automation that UFS is putting on. There's e-gaming. There's an event tonight that Mars Solutions Group is putting on regarding talent and restarting talent. There's a health tech pitch competition this evening at Wantable. Tomorrow, there's more talent topics, including building an inclusive ecosystem. Tomorrow, we also just finished a study of kind of the state of the startup ecosystem that we're going to be doing a report out on. And then, fun enough, it's too bad you're not here because we're going on a bus tour tomorrow, tech company to tech company. And if you haven't signed up, that's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to start at Zywave and go to a couple of tech companies. And then last but not least, there was one of the members of our community recommended that we do kind of a development day for the community, by the community, et cetera. There are, 10 topics tomorrow that is all about kind of personal development in tech skills, et cetera. And then last not least, but Marathon Machines is going to host a happy hour sponsored by both Rockwell and by our beer. It's almost encouraged. So thank you all for coming. We are going to do a couple of things. We're going to send a follow-up survey. We'd love response. responses. That's one of the hard things that's hard to get, but we'd love feedback, you know, about what progress you've seen, what gets you excited. I glossed over one, I think one that I'm excited about is we have over 5x sentiment increase in, do you see Milwaukee as a positive place for tech and or growing? That's huge, right? And that's in the last 2 years. So we're seeing the needle move. So what progress? What makes you hopeful? And last but not least, what do you think we should build on? What strengths do you think we should build on? So we'll do that as a survey, as a follow-up. With that said, you've been gracious enough to be here. Thank you. We're going to let you sign books, etc., so you can stay here. But I can't thank everybody for coming enough. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.